Well, good morning. I have to say I'm really impressed with the venue and the setup here. The grotto is certainly advancing, pretty amazing. Anyway, this morning I'd like to give a short talk on a cave in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. Yes, oh, there's Mary Alice, all right. And had I known that there was a gun show going on, I probably would have chosen a different word to use in the title. But nevertheless, this is a story that starts 15 years ago. So the story started back in 2008. And at that time, two of the pioneers of Montana caving, Jim Chester and Ron Zuber, organized a trip to the Bob to search for new caves. And after a lot of discussion and looking at maps and satellite photos, they picked an area that is southwest of the Slate Goat Mountain in the Bob Marshall. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but there's Scapegoat Mountain. Slate Goat Mountain. It's important to distinguish Slate Goat Mountain from Scapegoat Mountain. Scapegoat Mountain is in the Scapegoat Wilderness, and Slate Goat Mountain, this one, is in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. The Scapegoat Wilderness is to the south of the Bob. Anyway, the area they decided to go searching for caves is the area to the southwest of Slate Goat Mountain. So a group of us started out, and if you've been to the Bob, you know it's a wonderful place to go hiking. And so we did a 2-day hike, initially on trails and then cross country, until we got to a nice small meadow and set up camp and used that as a base camp to go search for caves. It's a spectacular area, as I mentioned. Just to the south of our camp are these huge expanses of limestone. And in the distance, if you can see it, it's the Chinese Wall to help locate the area. So we were looking east of the Chinese Wall at various limestone escarpments that looked promising. What we found over the course of the next several days was tantalizing and frustrating. There were lots of cave entrances, but they either didn't go anywhere or they looked like they were going someplace, but they were filled with rubble a short distance from the entrance. So the week was interesting but frustrating because we'd never found any real caves. Well, it was just getting near the end of the trip, and the three senior members of the trip, Ron Zuber, Mike McEachin, and Jim Chester, decided to go off on their own to search for caves. And so they left and took off, and they were gone for a long time. And the area that they ended up in is a place called Grizzly Gulch, which was a long distance from camp. And those of us back at camp were kind of worried when they didn't show up, and eventually they came back. And they were exhausted, but they were excited because they had found a real cave entrance. They found this cave entrance, which is a small entrance with a cave stream flowing into it. They went in, and not too far into the cave, they came to a lip of a pit with the cave stream flowing into it, and it looked like going cave down below. Well, unfortunately, they didn't have vertical equipment or ropes, so they couldn't go any further. So they came back out, and that night, we had a lot of discussions around the camp. First one was what to name the cave. Well, that was obvious. Name it after its discoverers, the Three Old Geezers. So it's called Three Old Geezers Cave, or 3OG. Secondly, we talked about plans to come back with more equipment, a better located base camp to explore the cave. So that happened the next year, in 2009. And we had more people, and also Jim and Ron are members of the Explorers Club, and they arranged to check out one of the Explorers Club's flags to bring along. So this was a combined Explorers Club grotto trip. And on that trip, two people sort of led the exploration, Ed Kudell and Adam Zuber. Ed is an expert mapper, and prior to the trip, he had heard about a new cave survey tool that was being developed by Beat Heeb in Switzerland. So he and I contacted Beat and obtained some parts and instructions and put together two first-generation Disto X's. These may have been among the first, if not the first, Disto X's used to survey a cave in Montana. So Ed and Adam and the rest spent the week exploring 30G, and Ed was able to come up with this map for about the first, it's just not quite 1,000, 900 plus feet of cave. The cave, the entrance is up at the top, and the end of exploration is down here. And the cave has a distinctly vertical character. At the farthest extent of the explored part of the cave, there are two sections that drop down. The first one on the right ends in a sump, and the other one has a crawlway continuing past the point of exploration. So that was very exciting. So that generated yet another trip in 2010 with more people. On this trip, there were a couple of other activities besides just trying to push the cave. One was looking for other entrances into the cave, if we could find one, which wasn't successful. And two, to do some dye tracing. I was interested in seeing if there was any evidence of another exit to the cave. And what we had found the year before was deep down in Grizzly Gulch. There's a waterfall pouring out of a cliff. And so this seemed to be an obvious place to maybe see if we could find some dye. So we set up a whole number of dye tracing samples, and we placed them in springs around the cave, adjoining cave streams, and also at this suspected resurgence deep down in Grizzly Gulch. At this point, I have to say that the trip ended sadly. Jim Chester was not able to make the trip that year because of some health problems. And we got news that Jim had died during the trip. Well, as you can imagine, that took the wind out of our sails, and the project had kind of lost its momentum. Well, then the samples that I had collected for doing the dye tracing were untouched for months, and that turned into years, and eventually I just forgot about them. So that's not the end of the story, though. It turned out that 11 years later, year before last, I was in for a surprise. Mike and I attended the Western Speleo Ed meeting in Weed, California. And at that meeting, Pat Cambyses gave a seminar on dye tracing. And she asked us, have any of you done dye tracing? And I said, oh yeah, I recall these old samples that I got from 30G. And I asked her, well, do you think they'd still be worthwhile to analyze? And she equivocated. She said, possibly, if they've been kept in the dark, because fluorescein degrades in sunlight. And I said, okay. So after the meeting, I got back home, and I started digging through my garage, and I found the samples buried under a pile of stuff. So I thought, well, yeah, they'd been kept in the dark. So at that point, I contacted Leanne Bledsoe at the Crawford Hydrology Lab in Kentucky, and arranged to have a subset of the samples I had collected analyzed. So that was done, and a month or so later, I got the results back. The results indicated that the fluorescein dye was not detected in any of the samples except one sample, and that was the sample that was placed at the resurgence. So I was pretty excited. Fortunately, just as a matter of protocol, I exposed duplicate samples at each location. So I found the duplicate of that one sample and then sent it back to the hydrology lab. I didn't have all the samples analyzed to start because just to save money, but I sent that second one back, and sure enough, the replicate sample also was positive. So it appears that there is a connection between the entrance or the sump at 30G and that resurgence. And also, because of the placement of the samples and the timing, it takes at least 48 hours for the dye to flow from the cave to the resurgence. So there is a hydrologic connection between 30G and this resurgence some distance away. And the terrain between these 2 points is a huge amount of limestone. Also, the resurgence is about 1,200 feet below the cave entrance. And the things that are enticing is that a crawl at the lowest export point in the cave continues on. It's not an easy crawl, and the cave is, cold and wet, but it continues. And secondly, it might be possible to gain entrance through the resurgence. We spent about a half hour trying to dig out the resurgence. Didn't make much progress, but got maybe 6 inches of clearance. And I imagine if you made a concerted effort, you might be able to enter the cave that way. So I'd like to just conclude by saying that 30G might be worth another look. And as far as I know, it's probably not been visited for over a decade, since 2010. So the cave is there, just waiting for somebody to come back to it. So that's my talk. Thank you.